This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the world. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/eyebrowcinema. Stop me if you've heard this one before. You're at the bar, talking about movies with your buddy, and at one point you say something like, I don't know, it just feels like all that comes out these days are superhero movies. And your friend responds with, oh, that's normal, there's always one genre at the top. Back in the 50s, they made hundreds of westerns every year before that genre died out. Superhero movies are just our modern western. They'll go away eventually. Variations of this argument have been used to rationalize and understand our superhero mania for at least a decade. Steven Spielberg made the comparison when predicting the death of the superhero movie in 2015, as did James Gunn in an Instagram post defending the superhero movie's artistry. Writers on sites like The Guardian, Esquire, and The Atlantic have gone further, arguing that the superhero market is actually less saturated than the cowboy was at the height of the western's popularity. When analyzing subversive or self-reflexive superhero movies, writers will often draw comparison to the revisionist westerns of the 1960s and 70s, films that took decades of well-worn genre tropes and flipped them on their head. And as always, there's Twitter, where dozens of users have made the point that superhero movies are the modern western. I don't want to give these tweets too much weight, given the nature of tweets are haphazardly thrown out hot takes, not well-researched essayistic arguments, and the credentials of these users to speak authoritatively on film history is fairly suspect. Even so, these comments, in conjunction by those of filmmakers, actors, and in various major publications, do indicate that this linking of the Western to the superhero movie is a persuasive and popular point of view. Whether made on the basis of criticism or flattery, there's a certain stability to connecting superhero movies with the classic westerns of old Hollywood. A sense that the dominant trends in American filmmaking merely reflect the ebb and flow of generic transformation. Audiences in the 50s had the cowboy as their myth. We have the superhero. It's not true, of course. Superhero movies are not equivalent to westerns, and the prevailing belief that they are reveals an inaccurate understanding of film history. I won't pretend like there aren't points of similarity. Both genres are escapist entertainments rooted in heroic valor, both are primarily action-oriented, both are examples of American myth-making, but the notion that superhero movies occupy the same place within the film industry that the Western did in classic Hollywood is flagrantly untrue. With this video, my goal is to dispel the myth that superhero movies are just like the Westerns of old, and to articulate why the contemporary dominance of superheroes at the multiplex is uniquely concerning for the present and future of American movies. Crucially though, I want to state up front that these arguments are not concerned with my own value judgments of superhero movies. I'm not here to weigh the artistic integrity of the genre, nor to dissuade you from enjoying these films. I enjoy a great many of them too. What I am here to do is to contextualize the modern superhero movie's place within the film industry, and how that compares to the space westerns occupied in Hollywood's supposed golden age, with specific emphasis on the 1930s through to the 1950s. And with that said, yes, it is true that more westerns were produced in these 3 decades alone than there have been superhero movies total. Just take a look at this chart, which demonstrates not only the explosion of western productions in classic Hollywood, but also the relatively scarce amount of superhero movies made in comparison. But this data makes for an incomplete picture that elides some key details. For one, westerns are typically far less expensive to produce than superhero films for a myriad of reasons which will be discussed later, so it makes sense the latter would be more scarce. Second, film production in general was much larger in the golden age of Hollywood than today, with more of every kind of movie being made in vast numbers. The high number of westerns is less indicative of genre dominance than it is the sheer enormity of Hollywood as a business before television cut into the market. To determine if westerns truly did dominate American movie screens the way superhero movies do now, we need to look at box office figures. How often were westerns among the year's highest grossing movies at the domestic box office in classic Hollywood? To narrow my sample size, let's specifically look at the domestic box office top 10 lists from 1930 to 1959, counting how many westerns appeared throughout the years. In total, 21 westerns made the box office top 10 in this time frame. That might sound like a lot of movies, but keep in mind we're looking at a period of 3 decades. Westerns weren't even averaging one highest grosser per year. And frankly, the classification of some of these movies is a little dubious. Boomtown and Giant are both listed as westerns on IMDb, but they're westerns the same way that There Will Be Blood is a western. Which is to say, they're dramas about land and oil which are set in the Old West. Each film shares some of the aesthetics and iconography of the western, but both ultimately follow different narrative conventions. A similar observation can be made of Saratoga Trunk, again classified as a western, but the movie plays out more like a sweeping costume drama and romance with Ingrid Bergman and Gary Cooper swooning for each other. I'm still counting all 3 movies towards the 21 total, but this notion that classic Hollywood was awash in gunslingers is not reflected in the box office. Only 7% of classic Hollywood's highest grossers are westerns, and of that 7%, less still are concerned with cowboys and shootouts. Comparatively, let's do the same thing for superhero movies, and we'll narrow our sample size further by only looking from 2008, the year the Marvel Cinematic Universe began, to 2020, the last year for which we have complete box office data for. 13 years versus the westerns 30, how many superhero movies landed in the domestic top 10s over this time period? A whopping 36. That's about 28% of all the highest grossing movies across the last 13 years. In less than half the time, superhero movies have eaten a far more substantial chunk of box office real estate than westerns ever did. Consider too that while westerns were a fairly consistent staple of the box office from the 30s through to the late 50s, they were far from the only game in town. Musicals ultimately took up a much greater portion of box office receipts, but there were also comedies, adventure movies, war films, romances, melodramas, biopics, period pieces, and prestige epics. I won't pretend this was some egalitarian period in filmmaking where every genre flourished. It's a rarity to see horror or science fiction among the highest grossers at this time, but there was a great degree of variety in the types of movies which thrived at the American box office. That sort of variety is in short supply in the box office champions of today. Even the non-superhero movies listed among the highest grossers of the last 13 years are not all that far removed from the 36 superhero movies I noted. I did not, for example, count the Transformers movies in my superhero movies tally, though you could argue I definitely should have. These movies are also about superpowered beings fighting against evil, and even have roots in comic books and other kids' media. No, Optimus! Indeed, a lot of the big hits of the last 13 years look very similar to the offerings of Marvel or DC. Big budget, effects heavy action movies, often with a sci-fi or fantasy flavor, with good guys fighting against the forces of evil as part of a franchise aimed, at least in part, at children. They share every aspect of superhero movies except the superheroes themselves. Though frankly, it's not that hard to imagine Dominic Toretto squaring off against Thanos. And to again reiterate, I'm not saying this type of blockbuster spectacle is inherently bad, but I do think there's a problem when almost nothing else can find a foothold at the box office. To illustrate this point, I'm going to borrow a page from Farron Smith-Nama's excellent essay, Box Office Blues, where she too tackles the superhero movies are like westerns myth and set up a criteria to identify films which don't lean on spectacle and still thrived at the box office. We'll once again be using the top 10 domestic box office lists from 2008 to 2020, this time counting movies which aren't special effects driven action movies about larger than life heroes fighting against evil, or aren't literal children's movies. Okay, how many do we got? 17. Less than half the amount of superhero movies that there are at the peak of the box office. I will add a quick disclaimer that movies like Inception, Tenet, and Gravity proved difficult to categorize, given they are non-franchise films made for adults, but they're still effects-heavy movies defined by their action set pieces. So I couldn't count them for this, even if I personally like them quite a bit. The Martian was also borderline, but given its emphasis lay more in character and problem-solving rather than extravagant action, I decided it did count. But these numbers are still pretty generous. I initially had 17 until I took a closer look at some of the movies. This total was counting the 5 Twilight movies, given they center on romance rather than action, but they're debatably still effects-driven. They are also, rather undebatably, a major franchise which isn't made for adults. So really, the number is down to 12. Then you've got the Guy Ritchie Sherlock Holmes movies, which are ostensibly adult-oriented literature adaptations, but they're also large-budget action movies which turn Sherlock into an almost superhuman hero who gets into epic fistfights. So, we're down to 10. Out of the 130 movies to rank among the highest grossers across the last 13 years, 10 were made for adults and offered something other than big-budget action spectacle. And I know I said I wasn't going to be passing my own value judgments in this video, but looking at these 10, which include Bohemian Rhapsody and The Blind Side...
Not exactly Christmas, is it?
All this to say, the notion that the superhero movie's current stranglehold over the film industry is comparable to the westerns of yesteryear is plainly false. Even when the cowboy was most overrepresented at the domestic box office, the dominance was nowhere near what superhero movies hold today. Of all the years I looked at, the one whose box office was most awash in westerns was 1940, with 4: Boomtown, Northwest Passage, Northwest Mounted Police, and Santa Fe Trail. In the other 6 slots, we have 3 comedies, 1 screwball, 1 romantic, and 1 political satire, a musical, a war epic, and a gothic romance/thriller. There's variety and depth to the genres and styles that just doesn't exist in the modern box office. But box office in and of itself is not the only pertinent distinction between the Western and the superhero movie. There's also the matter of who's hoarding all that profit in the first place. In addition to tallying all the Westerns and superhero movies to crack their respective eras' top 10s, I also kept track of which studios produced each film. When it comes to the 21 Westerns, production is split pretty evenly between 7 studios. Paramount leads with 6 movies, followed swiftly by Warner Brothers with 5. MGM has 3, RKO, United Artists, and 20th Century Fox each have 2 apiece, and Selznick International trails with just 1. Balance isn't perfect, but it's pretty close, especially when you remember that Selznick International was a much smaller company that only lasted a little more than 10 years. Studio production of the 36 superhero movies, on the other hand, is a lot more concentrated. We're down to 5 studios, with Fox and Paramount tied for last with 3 movies each. Sony limps ahead with 4, Warner Brothers takes a massive jump in second with 11, but the top dog, naturally, is Disney, with 15. Things are suddenly a lot more lopsided. You might argue that the Western's highest earners were also technically dominated by 2 studios, but the discrepancies in numbers were far less vast. With superhero movies, there's little ambiguity about who's winning, at least financially. Then again, you might be surprised that Disney's lead isn't in fact greater, that they're only ahead 11% from their nearest runner-up. That's because this data still credits the original distributor, not the current rights holder. Disney has since acquired 20th Century Fox and their extensive film library, including the X-Men and Deadpool films. Paramount remains its own studio, but its 3 superhero movies in this list were Marvel Studios productions, whose distribution rights have since diverted to Disney. 2 of Sony's Spider-Man movies were co-productions with Marvel, and therefore still promoting Disney's brand and agenda. It wouldn't be right to take these titles away from Sony's count, but they should also be added to Disney's total. So, actually, the studio breakdown of the 36 superhero movies looks like this. And just like that, Disney controls the box office for more than half the genre, to say nothing of their cultural dominance outside of the superhero realm through similar acquisitions like Pixar and Lucasfilm. This is perhaps the most profound distinction between westerns and superhero movies. No one studio ever owned the western the way Disney now owns superhero movies. Disney may not legally hold rights to the genre, but they are so dominant within the superhero marketplace that it is functionally theirs. That growing monopoly is limiting, not only for non-blockbuster films to find a footing with general audiences, but it's also limiting for the superhero movie as a genre. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that, historically, westerns have been relatively inexpensive to produce. On a certain level, this is a matter of production value. If you could afford some prop guns and a horse, you essentially had the resources to make a western. The major studios could certainly offer bigger and more extravagant western epics, but scrappy independent companies could still produce reliable B-movie entertainments, which performed well financially and still to this day prove artistically rewarding. Superhero movies, on the other hand, typically require a degree of spectacle and emphasis on special effects, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars, and therefore are almost exclusively the domain of major studios. There's no room for the equivalent of a Samuel Fuller or Bud Boddicker to experiment with the genre's tropes and form on a smaller and less costly scale. Everything has to be huge. Small directors are scooped up by the likes of Disney to quickly transition from making $1 million movies to $100 million movies. But it's not just small productions which are effectively shut out of the superhero genre. Among today's major studios, only 2 have real skin in the superhero movie game, with Sony doing its best to keep up. Paramount or Universal can still afford to make $200 million effects-driven blockbusters, but they don't touch superhero movies anymore. That's likely because the real cost of superhero movies is not in CGI armies, but the intellectual properties themselves. Superhero movies are less a distinct genre than they are a series of brands. As John Health wrote back in 2014, no one really goes to see a superhero film as much as they go to see Batman, Spider-Man, X-Men, Iron Man, Superman, and Avengers films. That these brands would be prominently controlled by just 2 studios is not surprising, given decades prior to dominating multiplexes, the superhero market had been thoroughly cornered in comic books by Marvel and DC, with each's library now being licensed almost exclusively by 1 studio each. Even the more obscure superhero movies to make hit films still come with the branding of either one or the other. Of the 36 superhero movies highlighted here, only 2 are not Marvel or DC adaptations: Incredibles 2 and Hancock. Incredibles 2 is, of course, still a legacy sequel to a beloved family movie, complete with the dual branding of both Disney and Pixar. Hancock, meanwhile, is actually one of the more anomalous superhero movies here. An original superhero created exclusively for the big screen, a non-franchise film, and one of the top 5 highest grossers of its year. It's also one of the oldest films in the sample, itself a relic from an era where a movie star's presence was enough to make a hit. the film certainly remains the exception to the rule. The few original superhero movies since Hancock have mostly been box office failures, and efforts at adapting non-Marvel or DC comic heroes have been middlingly successful at best. Westerns too have their share of heroes who've seen multiple iterations over time, but you'd be hard-pressed to describe these characters as brands. An audience might carry certain expectations of what a Jesse James or Billy the Kid or Wyatt Earp movie should be, but these Western heroes were never the sole property of just one studio. Theoretically, anyone could make a Wyatt Earp movie, and without the strict costs of licensing or managing brand integrity, filmmakers were much freer to experiment with the representation of these characters. There are some consistent elements. Jesse James is always an outlaw, Billy the Kid is always defined by his youth, Wyatt Earp is always a lawman. But the tone, style, and focus of the narrative is flexible. The story of Wyatt Earp can be a star-studded action movie or a lean and muscular tale of law and order, but it can also be a melancholic love story with loose plotting, more attuned to atmosphere and setting than moments of violence. Jesse James can be a Robin Hood-type hero fighting against a corrupt government, but he can also be just the catalyst for exploring the guilt and anguish of his assassin. And this is to say nothing of the fact that dozens of the most popular and acclaimed westerns of classic Hollywood were original works of fiction, which did not bank on familiarity with established characters. This doesn't mean every Western Hollywood made at its peak was a blazing work of originality and bravura filmmaking. Like any genre, if you stare at it long enough, a lot of the movies do start to blend together. But even so, the freedom and flexibility of the Western allowed for tremendous variety and depth at all levels of production. With the superhero movie, that variety is reduced to one distinction: Marvel or DC. There is some variation within these categories, but not nearly the degree to which the Western enjoyed. Marvel in particular has a well-identified in-house formula. Doomsday plots built around evil villains and magical MacGuffins, quippy banter, big explosive third acts, and muted gray color palettes. DC, perhaps because they're clearly in second place, are generally more willing to experiment with more violent or explicitly political content and a grander visual style. But they too lean on the same Doomsday plot, MacGuffin, big explosive third act combo that Marvel does. The result is a much more constrained and limited genre, with little room for experimentation. Essays which discuss transformation in the superhero genre, like Brogan Morris's piece on the Suicide Squad or Nerdwriter's video on Logan, will often draw comparison to the self-referential westerns of the 1960s and 70s. A time when the genre's space as Hollywood entertainment was gradually starting to decline, and the movies started to comment upon themselves. But a key reason why the spaghetti western or revisionist western could emerge in the first place was because the low costs and lack of IPs allowed oddballs and outsiders to make weird, interesting art within an established form. Access to the Western allowed it to be transformed. Is there room for transformation in the superhero movie? Some. There have been a handful of what might be considered revisionist superhero movies in recent years. Films that either self-reflexively comment on themselves and the genre, or that demythologize their heroes. But they still come from the same two dominant brands, and therefore still needed brand approval. Access to outsiders is strictly limited, with Marvel and DC carefully controlling their IPs. The superhero movie can transform, but it can only be as revisionist or transgressive as the rights-holding corporations allow it to be. But even if every superhero movie was a radically bold and creative swing, completely distinct from what had come before, Disney and Warner's duopoly means it would still be the illusion of variety. Because like Coke or Pepsi, there's really only one choice to be made. So if the modern superhero movie is not really reflective of the Western at all, is there any precedent for this sort of genre dominance at the box office? The closest would be the rise of the roadshow epics of the 1950s and 60s. The roadshow was a form of premium exhibition, where big and expensive movies like musicals or historical epics were given limited theatrical runs in elegant movie palaces, screened without trailers and accompanied by an intermission before receiving a wide release in traditional theaters. The roadshow had existed in Hollywood as far back as the silent era, but the rise of television in the 1950s revitalized the practice as built around widescreen cinematography formats like CinemaScope. Starting in 1953 with The Robe and This Is Cinerama to about the late 1960s, roadshow movies dominated the box office. From 1953 to 1969, 48 roadshow movies landed in the domestic annual box office top 10 lists. Those numbers mirror that of superhero movies between 2008 and 2020, as does their gradual growth over time. Like superhero movies, we see a small amount of roadshow movies in each year's top 10, rising to eventually taking up the bulk of the list. Both the roadshow and the superhero movie are also burdened by their own grandness. Just as a roadshow release needs an epic runtime to justify the intermission, superhero movies need to be full of action-packed spectacle. Black Panther is a movie about conflicting ideologies, but it still needs to end with CGI armies and fully animated fight scenes. Black Widow doesn't have superpowers and hews closer to spy than superhero, but her solo movie still climaxes with a floating metal fortress and free-falling thousands of feet. There are exceptions to these rules, but there is also an expectation of bigness that the roadshow and superhero film share. But there are some key distinctions too. For one, the roadshow isn't really a genre so much as it is a loosely defined style, consisting of large-scale, expensive productions with massive runtimes. Those typically looked like musicals, historical epics, or biblical epics, but they could also be movies about journeying the cosmos, or Formula One racing. Virtually any story could be told in the roadshow style. That type of variety is well represented in the sample of films between 1953 and 1969, with 12 different studios sharing in the riches. Fox and MGM are clearly occupying the most space, but the other studios are at least still competitive. But if we stick with the roadshow comparison, the relevant question becomes, why did the roadshow fall out of fashion? The simplest answer would be that a number of high-profile flops eventually rendered the format, which remember was extremely expensive in the first place, too costly and unprofitable. Budgets were so high that even when a film cracked the box office top 10, it could still lose money.
What are you talking about?
Cleopatra was the highest grossing film of 1963, and it still failed to recoup its costs. Could something similar happen to the superhero movie? It's possible, I guess. Astronomically high budgets mean modern blockbusters need to make ludicrous amounts of money, and there have already been cases where hundreds of millions of dollars still isn't enough. Justice League made $229 million domestically, and it was the 10th highest grossing movie of 2017, and it still fell drastically short of the film's $300 million budget. Worldwide grosses seemingly make up for that, but keep in mind this $300 million does not account for Justice League's marketing costs, nor the extra $70 million put up to complete Zack Snyder's cut of the film. Still, this is only one Cleopatra-esque disaster, and there aren't strong indicators that more are to follow. Throughout the pandemic, where box office for all films has been uniformly down, superhero movies still reign supreme. And box office isn't the all-important metric it was in the 50s. Even big movies have begun debuting directly to streaming platforms, where users don't typically pay for individual titles, but to access entire catalogs. a system which unambiguously favors brands, and the type of brand loyalty superhero movies engender in their audience. Of course, the other factor which precipitated the death of the roadshow was the success of the new Hollywood. Just as these old-fashioned, momentous productions were losing money left and right, a younger generation of filmmakers unleashed a new breed of adult-oriented cinema, which proved unexpected hits and redefined the present and future of American movies. And while there are certainly films of this ambition and formal skill made for adults today, they no longer make a dent at the highest echelons of the box office. Unless, perhaps, they're already part of a pre-packaged brand. It's not lost on me that the last adult-oriented, character-driven drama to become a top 10 hit and thoroughly penetrate the cultural zeitgeist was Joker, another superhero movie. Is this the future of cinema, where adult entertainments come in the safe packaging of recognizable IP and endless iterations on already existing brands and copyrighted trademarks? I don't know. I'm not here to guess at the future. As the many "lol, this aged well" comments my videos get will tell you, I'm not especially good at prediction. What I do know is that the modern domination of superhero movies at the multiplex is not the natural course of a film genre's history, nor are superheroes simply our modern myths brought to life on the silver screen. Rather, the superhero movie contributes directly to the consolidation of corporate power in the movie business, and is symptomatic of an industry swelling ever larger and more expensive, while simultaneously becoming more narrow and less varied. It is not a question of the artistic worth of individual films, which is subjective and endlessly debatable, but of who controls the motion picture industry and what possibilities exist for creating movies within that system. Maybe that matters to you, and maybe it doesn't. But whatever we make of the superhero movie, I can promise you that it has nothing to do with Westerns. Thank you to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service where you can watch some of the most beautiful and incredible works of cinema from around the world. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. And these movies don't come from a faceless algorithm, but are hand-picked by actual human beings. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. And hey, good news for my fellow Canadians, Memories of Murder was recently added for Mubi users in the Great White North. This was actually the last Bong Joon-ho feature I had left to see, and it was so exciting to finally cross this seminal title off my list. And the best part, you can watch it and a whole host of amazing cinema for free right now. Just head to mubi.com/eyebrowcinema for a free 30 days. That's a whole month of great movies for free.